taking my baby away. They don't believe me.
Don't make a scene, sir. Your testimony can't really be changed.
Judge mocks disabled hells, angels, but has no idea who's watching. When Judge Harrison systematically mocked disabled Marine veteran Tank Iron Rodriguez during his custody hearing, calling him an unfit father because of his Hells Angels patches, he had no idea that a retired Supreme Court justice was watching from the back row, documenting every word. Riverside County Family Court buzzed with institutional indifference. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished wood that had witnessed decades of broken families. Gavel strikes decided children's futures based on appearance rather than character. Here, prejudice wore judicial robes. Bias masqueraded as legal wisdom. Justice was auctioned to highest bidder, while fairness suffocated under bureaucratic indifference. Tank Iron Rodriguez sat at defendant's table with dignity 3 Iraq tours had carved into his soul. At 42, invisible wounds cost him civilian jobs, but never diminished his love for 8-year-old Sophia. Phoenix Hells Angels patches told stories of brotherhood forged through military service. Family court saw only criminal stereotypes: Purple Heart recipient, Bronze Star for valor. Medical discharge after IED blast left him with traumatic brain injury and PTSD. Traditional employment became impossible. Parenting abilities remained intact. Ex-wife questioned everything through lawyers who understood manipulation better than human character. Tank's weathered hands showed battles. Months of rehabilitation learning to manage invisible disabilities. Father-daughter relationship that divorce proceedings threatened to sever. Sophia meant everything. Court system treated her like property to be divided rather than child needing loving father's guidance. Tank's challenge transcended custody disputes. It was proving parental fitness. When judicial prejudice treated motorcycle patches as evidence of unfitness. How do you demonstrate worth when appearance invites systematic discrimination? Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about. Today, Tank would discover who was fighting alongside him. Your Honor, Attorney Richard Chen declared with theatrical authority, Mr. Rodriguez's association with known criminal organization creates unsafe environment for minor child who deserves protection from violent influences. Tank's attorney, Sarah Martinez, presented counter evidence: military service records, community involvement, exemplary parenting history. No incidents suggesting danger to Sophia. Nothing except appearance-based prejudice. Judge Harrison's expression revealed predetermined conclusions. Tank's patches had already triggered systematic bias against veterans whose motorcycle culture challenged comfortable assumptions about parental fitness. Mr. Rodriguez, Harrison interrupted Martinez's presentation, explained to this court how association with criminal motorcycle gang qualifies you as appropriate guardian for impressionable young girl. Tank maintained military bearing despite verbal assault. Your Honor, Phoenix Hells Angels is brotherhood organization composed primarily of military veterans supporting each other through challenges civilian society fails to understand. Harrison's mockery began. Spare me the romanticized mythology. This court deals with reality, not fairy tales about motorcycle gangs being charitable organizations. Systematic prejudice was becoming obvious to courtroom observers who witnessed judicial authority abusing disabled veteran whose only crime was seeking custody of daughter he'd never harmed. Harrison's treatment escalated beyond professional procedure into personal entertainment designed to humiliate disabled veteran whose appearance provided convenient target for judicial authority that confused power with wisdom. Military service doesn't excuse criminal association, Harrison declared, dismissing Tank's combat decorations. Your PTSD diagnosis indicates psychological instability. How does mental deficiency qualify you as suitable parent? Tank's response demonstrated grace under assault. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, Your Honor. My condition is managed through treatment. It doesn't impair parenting abilities that have never been questioned except through divorce manipulation. Martinez attempted intervention with expert testimony about PTSD management. Harrison's prejudice prevented consideration of evidence that might contradict his predetermined conclusion. 50 Phoenix Hells Angels members filled gallery with disciplined silence despite witnessing systematic abuse of brother whose character exceeded Harrison's demonstrated integrity. Their presence commanded attention from everyone except the judge. Mr. Rodriguez, Harrison continued with sadistic satisfaction, your brain injury and psychological problems create dangerous environment. This court questions your fundamental fitness for civilized society, much less responsible parenthood. The verbal assault surpassed professional misconduct to become systematic dehumanization of combat veteran whose service had protected Harrison's right to wear robes. He was dishonoring. Martinez presented comprehensive evidence of Tank's parental excellence, Sophia's academic achievements, father-daughter activities, community involvement through veteran advocacy, character references from teachers, neighbors, coaches. Every piece of evidence was dismissed. Documents can be fabricated, Harrison declared. References can be bought. This court is concerned with protecting innocent child from damaged individual whose military experience clearly rendered him unfit for normal family life. Tank absorbed systematic abuse with dignity that military service had taught. His response carried weight that Harrison couldn't comprehend. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, sir, but some battles teach you what really matters, protecting people you love from those who would harm them. The gallery stirred. Something in Tank's tone suggested deeper meaning. Retired Supreme Court Justice David Park shifted in back row, his presence unrecognized by Harrison, whose attention remained focused on humiliating Tank rather than conducting fair hearing. Park's legal expertise recognized systematic bias, violating constitutional protections. His military background provided understanding of veteran challenges that Harrison's civilian inexperience prevented him from appreciating. The retired justice began documenting every word, every gesture, every violation of legal ethics he was witnessing. Tank's ordeal was being recorded by someone with power to ensure justice. Mr. Rodriguez, Harrison announced with theatrical cruelty, medical records indicate you're fundamentally defective as parent. Brain damage and psychological instability make you dangerous to vulnerable child needing protection from mentally damaged individual. The courtroom gasped. Even lawyers exchanged uncomfortable glances. This transcended professional misconduct. Tank maintained composure despite verbal violence. Your Honor, PTSD affects millions of combat veterans who've sacrificed for national defense. My condition doesn't impair parenting abilities that have never been questioned, except through proceedings motivated by custody advantage rather than Sophia's welfare. Harrison leaned forward like predator sensing weakness. Are you lecturing this court about mental health, Mr. Rodriguez? because your condition appears to include delusions about your fitness for responsible parenthood. 50 veterans watched systematic abuse of brother whose character exceeded their tormentors' demonstrated integrity. Their silent solidarity provided Tank strength to endure judicial cruelty. Justice Park documented violations with prosecutorial precision. Every word would be reviewed by authorities whose oversight could end Harrison's career. Martinez attempted objection. Your Honor, this line of questioning violates. Overruled. Mr. Rodriguez will answer questions about his mental competency. The proceeding had become sadistic entertainment disguised as legal procedure. Phoenix Hells Angels maintained disciplined silence despite witnessing systematic persecution of brother, whose service had exceeded their observers' contributions. Their collective military experience created palpable tension as judicial authority abused disabled veteran. Ghost Martinez recognized constitutional violations from his paralegal training. Roadkill Thompson understood systematic bias from his construction business experience with veteran employees. Iron Mike's law enforcement background identified procedures that violated every standard of professional conduct. The Brotherhood's loyalty transcended typical support. They were documenting misconduct for federal civil rights complaint that would soon destroy Harrison's career through channels he couldn't control. Mrs. Sophia Martinez, Tank's neighbor, prepared to testify about exemplary parenting, including daily homework help, weekend adventures, patient guidance that had shaped Sophia into confident, well-adjusted child, whose development reflected positive parenting that divorce proceedings characterized as harmful influence. Justice Park's presence remained undetected as he coordinated preliminary investigation through encrypted communications with former Supreme Court clerks, whose current positions provided oversight capabilities that would soon transform individual custody dispute into federal constitutional crisis. Tank's systematic humiliation was being witnessed by people whose understanding of justice exceeded family courts' demonstrated bias, while their authority could restore constitutional protections that Harrison was violating through systematic discrimination against disabled veterans. Harrison's cruelty reached unprecedented levels. Mr. Rodriguez, this court finds you fundamentally unfit for custody due to criminal motorcycle gang association, brain damage from military service, and psychological defects that render you dangerous to civilized society. The decision was predetermined, based entirely on prejudice rather than evidence, systematic discrimination rather than child welfare, institutional bias rather than legal standards. Tank's response carried dignity that Harrison's cruelty couldn't destroy. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, Your Honor. My battles taught me that protecting family means standing against those who abuse power to harm innocent people. Justice Park rose from his seat. Authority commanded immediate attention as authentic legal power confronted systematic judicial misconduct. Judge Harrison. The voice carried weight of Supreme Court service. I am retired Supreme Court Justice David Park, and I have observed systematic violations of due process, equal protection, and judicial ethics that mandate immediate intervention. Harrison's face went white. Processing identity of observer whose legal authority exceeded his own while providing oversight that could end his career through misconduct documentation no administrative protection could defend. The confrontation between Supreme Court and family court would either restore legal integrity or expose institutional corruption that protected prejudiced authority from accountability when disabled veterans faced systematic discrimination. Park's intervention transformed custody hearing into constitutional proceeding. Your treatment of Mr. Rodriguez violates Americans with Disabilities Act, constitutes systematic discrimination against military veterans, and represents judicial misconduct exceeding tolerance for legal system abuse. The courtroom erupted as 50 Hells Angels realized Brotherhood's systematic humiliation had been witnessed by legal authority, whose intervention would ensure justice that family court had abandoned through prejudice disguised as child protection. Harrison attempted damage control. Justice Park, this court operates under state jurisdiction. Wrong. Federal civil rights violations fall under Supreme Court oversight. Your systematic bias against disabled veteran creates constitutional crisis requiring immediate federal intervention. Martinez coordinated with Park's legal team to file emergency civil rights complaint, while Tank maintained dignity throughout confrontation that would soon restore his constitutional protections through authentic legal authority. Tank's ordeal had activated networks extending beyond motorcycle culture to include Supreme Court justice, whose intervention would transform individual discrimination into federal precedent, protecting disabled veterans from systematic judicial bias. The battle for Tank's parental rights had become war for constitutional integrity. Justice would finally be served. Justice Park's detailed citation of Harrison's violations created immediate legal crisis. Federal authorities were activated through channels that local administrative protection couldn't control or influence. Judge Harrison has violated Federal Civil Rights Act Section 1983, Americans with Disabilities Act, and judicial conduct standards through systematic discrimination against disabled military veteran based on appearance rather than evidence. Park's prosecutorial precision documented constitutional violations while coordinating emergency intervention by Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, whose investigation would determine whether Harrison's misconduct warranted immediate removal from bench. Harrison's attempt to maintain authority crumbled under Supreme Court scrutiny. Justice Park, you have no jurisdiction in state family court proceedings. Federal civil rights violations transcend state boundaries. Your systematic persecution of disabled veteran creates constitutional emergency requiring immediate Supreme Court oversight to prevent further damage to legal system integrity. Tank watched impossible reversal of fortune as authentic legal authority confronted institutional bias that had nearly destroyed his relationship with Sophia through systematic discrimination disguised as child protection, but revealed as judicial abuse of power. Phoenix Hells Angels maintained protective formation around brother, whose dignity throughout systematic humiliation had demonstrated character, exceeding their persecutors' professional qualifications, while inspiring loyalty that transcended typical support to include federal constitutional protection. Martinez coordinated emergency filings, while Park's intervention attracted national media attention that would transform individual custody dispute into landmark civil rights case, protecting disabled veterans from systematic judicial bias. Department of Justice Emergency Response Team arrived as Justice Park maintained constitutional oversight of proceedings that had devolved into systematic persecution of disabled veteran whose service had protected judicial system integrity that Harrison was currently destroying through misconduct. This proceeding is suspended pending federal investigation of constitutional violations, Park announced, with authority that commanded compliance from court personnel whose careers depended on cooperation with Supreme Court oversight rather than protection of prejudiced colleague. Tank's response demonstrated grace that military service had taught. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about. Today, I learned some battles require intervention from people who understand justice means more than prejudice disguised as legal authority. Harrison faced impossible choice: acknowledge systematic misconduct or face federal prosecution for civil rights violations that could result in imprisonment rather than mere career termination through judicial discipline that local authorities might have negotiated. Federal investigators documented evidence of systematic bias while coordinating with veteran advocacy organizations whose resources would ensure Tank received comprehensive legal representation exceeding family court's demonstrated capability to provide constitutional protection for disabled veterans. Sophia's custody would be decided by federal court whose jurisdiction transcended local prejudice through constitutional authority that protected disabled veterans from systematic discrimination while ensuring children's welfare through evidence-based decisions rather than appearance-based bias. Justice Park's intervention had transformed Tank's individual ordeal into precedent, protecting thousands of disabled veterans from similar persecution by judicial authorities, whose prejudice had been enabled through inadequate oversight and insufficient accountability for constitutional violations. Federal court's emergency hearing restored Tank's constitutional rights while suspending Harrison pending investigation that would determine criminal prosecution for systematic civil rights violations exceeding administrative misconduct to include federal crimes against disabled veteran. Tank's reunion with Sophia, supervised by federal authorities rather than biased state court, demonstrated father-daughter relationship that divorce proceedings had threatened to destroy through systematic judicial persecution disguised as child protection but revealed as institutional discrimination against disabled veteran. "Daddy, why were those people being mean to you?" Sophia asked with 8-year-old innocence that cut through legal complexity to expose fundamental injustice that federal intervention had corrected through constitutional protection. Tank's response demonstrated character that systematic abuse couldn't destroy. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, sweetheart. But today, we learned that some people fight battles to protect others when systems fail to provide justice that everyone deserves." Justice Park's establishment of federal oversight for veteran custody cases would prevent future discrimination while ensuring that Tank's ordeal created lasting protection for disabled veterans whose service had earned constitutional recognition rather than systematic persecution from judicial authorities whose bias violated everything American legal system claimed to represent. The Brotherhood's loyalty had been vindicated through Supreme Court intervention that proved authentic character transcended appearance-based prejudice when constitutional authority intervened to restore justice that local systems had abandoned. Tank's case became landmark precedent establishing federal protection for disabled veterans in custody proceedings. Justice Park's intervention created oversight mechanism preventing systematic judicial bias, while requiring accommodation rather than discrimination when service-connected disabilities affected legal proceedings. Harrison's removal from bench following federal investigation sent clear message that constitutional violations against disabled veterans would face Supreme Court accountability regardless of local administrative protection that had previously enabled systematic persecution. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Tank told national media. "But those battles become winnable when legal system remembers justice means protecting rather than persecuting people whose service exceeded their persecutors' contributions." Phoenix Hells Angels' respectful support throughout ordeal had challenged stereotypes while demonstrating community values that aligned with constitutional principles when authentic character was tested through systematic adversity, requiring collective response exceeding individual capability. Tank's victory inspired comprehensive judicial reform, requiring training on military disabilities and constitutional protections for disabled veterans whose service-connected conditions had been systematically misunderstood as parental incompetence rather than invisible wounds requiring accommodation. Department of Justice established permanent oversight for veteran custody cases, while Tank became national advocate for disabled veterans' rights. His testimony before Congress influenced legislation protecting military families from systematic discrimination, disguised as child welfare. Sophia's relationship with father strengthened through ordeal that had demonstrated Tank's character while exposing institutional failures that federal intervention had corrected through constitutional enforcement exceeding local authorities' demonstrated capability. Justice Park's federal court appointment to oversee veteran custody cases created permanent protection against systematic judicial bias, while establishing precedent that disabled veteran service-connected conditions required accommodation rather than discrimination through legal proceedings. Tank's civil rights settlement provided financial security, while funding veteran advocacy programs that prevented future discrimination through education and legal oversight that challenged institutional prejudice whenever constitutional violations threatened disabled veterans' parental rights. Phoenix Hells Angels established Veteran Legal Support Network connecting disabled veterans with constitutional protection while demonstrating that motorcycle club values aligned with legal principles when authentic character faced systematic adversity requiring community response. Harrison's federal prosecution for civil rights violations created deterrent effect, preventing future judicial misconduct against disabled veterans while establishing criminal penalties for systematic discrimination that had previously faced only administrative discipline through inadequate oversight. Tank's integration into federal veteran advocacy network provided platform for addressing institutional failures while maintaining relationship with Phoenix chapter, whose loyalty had been vindicated through Supreme Court intervention that proved brotherhood values aligned with constitutional principles. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about" became Tank's signature message at judicial conferences nationwide, but those battles create lasting change when constitutional authority intervenes to protect rather than persecute people whose service deserves recognition rather than systematic discrimination. 2 years later, Tank had become regional coordinator for disabled veteran legal advocacy while maintaining primary custody of Sophia, whose academic and social development reflected positive parenting that systematic judicial persecution had failed to destroy through constitutional violations that federal intervention had corrected. Justice Park's ongoing mentorship provided Tank with legal expertise, while Phoenix Hells Angels family offered community support that transcended typical social boundaries to include people whose loyalty had been tested through adversity that revealed authentic character exceeding civilian understanding of sacrifice and service. Sophia's testimony at congressional hearing about her father's character influenced national policy protecting military families from systematic discrimination. "My daddy fought battles to protect people, and when bad people tried to hurt him, his family fought battles to protect him back." Tank's relationship with ex-wife had evolved into cooperative co-parenting focused on Sophia's welfare, rather than custody manipulation that had triggered constitutional crisis, exposing systematic judicial bias, requiring federal oversight to prevent future violations. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Tank concluded his congressional testimony. "But when constitutional authority stands with people whose service exceeded their persecutors' contributions, those battles create lasting protection for others facing similar discrimination that requires community response transcending individual capability." The Phoenix Hells Angels chapter had established permanent legal advocacy fund, while Tank's story inspired similar protection programs nationwide, demonstrating that authentic character transcended appearance-based prejudice. When constitutional principles were properly enforced through federal oversight rather than local administrative indifference to systematic violations. Justice Park's judicial reform legacy would protect thousands of disabled veterans from discrimination while ensuring that Tank's ordeal created comprehensive precedent rather than isolated victory, proving that constitutional intervention could restore justice when local systems failed to provide adequate protection for people whose sacrifice had earned recognition rather than persecution from institutions they had protected through military service. Tank's case established permanent federal protection for disabled veterans in custody proceedings while inspiring nationwide judicial reform requiring constitutional training on military disabilities and civil rights protections that prevented systematic discrimination disguised as child welfare. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Tank told audiences nationwide, "but when legal system chooses constitutional protection over systematic prejudice, those battles create lasting change, protecting others whose service deserves recognition rather than persecution from institutions they sacrificed to defend." Justice Park's oversight program had trained thousands of judges, while Phoenix Hells Angels Legal Advocacy Network provided disabled veterans with constitutional protection that transcended local prejudice through federal authority that enforced civil rights regardless of appearance-based bias. Tas Jong Lao, Daiva Tong Jiep, the enduring protection, 80 Turchin. 5 years later, Tank had become national voice for disabled veteran rights while maintaining strong relationship with Sophia, whose father-daughter bond had been strengthened rather than severed through ordeal that demonstrated character transcending systematic adversity when constitutional authority provided protection. Harrison's imprisonment for federal civil rights violations served as deterrent, preventing future judicial misconduct against disabled veterans while establishing criminal accountability for systematic discrimination that previous administrative oversight had failed to address adequately. Sometimes justice comes from unexpected observers who understand that constitutional principles transcend prejudice, teaching us that everyone deserves protection from systematic discrimination regardless of appearance, and that authentic character endures when people choose constitutional integrity over institutional bias that fails those whose service exceeded their persecutors' contributions. The strongest people are usually fighting battles you know nothing about, and sometimes those battles require constitutional intervention from people who understand that justice means protecting rather than persecuting, showing us that authentic authority serves rather than discriminates, and that federal oversight ensures civil rights protection when local systems fail. People whose sacrifice earned recognition rather than systematic persecution from institutions they defended through military service, exceeding their persecutors' civilian contributions to community welfare.